Good morning, Shelves. It's Thursday and my beard is scraggly and definitely in need of a trim, but I am way too tired to do it, although this time I am tired for different reasons. The reason I'm tired this time has nothing to do with how little sleep I've had, though I have had very little sleep. It actually has to do with, well, I think the best way to explain it would be through the term third culture kid, or TCK for short, which is used to define kids like me who grew up in a culture that was not their parents. What that leads to is that you take part of the culture of your parents and part of the culture of where you grew up with, and you mix it together to create your own culture and your own identity. Or at least that's how it's supposed to work in theory. In my case, it was a little bit weirder than that. Despite what people might racistly assume from my appearance, I was born and raised in Brazil. So were my parents and so were my grandparents and so on and so forth for some time until they was somewhere else because immigration is a thing. That being said, because my grandmother taught Portuguese at an American school, her kids grew up going to an American school. My mother also got a scholarship and went to study in the United States and came back later, so that means that her higher education was also in English. So my mother grew up with a fairly different encoded cultural experience from most Brazilians, and she passed that on to me. And my case further complicated it because when I was about 12, we moved to Mexico. Now, though being the precocious kid I was at 12, I was already studying Spanish. It wasn't enough to just put me in a Mexican school, so instead I was put in a bilingual American school where I would learn both Spanish and English, at which point I of course made friends and integrated and all that nice stuff, except that my integration was very different from what happens to a lot of other TCKs because I never really integrated with Mexican culture per se, as much as I integrated with a sort of international tribe that exists within Mexican culture. Which was fine though, because I actually never planned to stay in Mexico, and I didn't. I left, except that I then came back, and I'm the only one that came back. None of my friends, literally none of my friends, stayed here. And that's actually not that odd. If you're a TCK, you're kind of used to the idea that your friends leave or you leave and all that stuff. But the reason I think this is important to point out is because it's symptomatic of something else. The reason my friends never came back is because they had nothing that held them here, because they weren't really attached to Mexican culture itself. Because we live in a world where you grow up is not exactly the most defining characteristic of what culture you experience. So sure, as a TCK, part of my identity is composed of facets from Mexican culture. It is inevitable that it be so, but I am perhaps more than I am Brazilian or Mexican. I am internet. And that might sound really strange, but if you were a social loner like me when growing up, that makes perfect sense because it means that most of the people you were interacting with, most of the content you were consuming and producing was all on the internet, which is frustrating because that means that I never really read that much or wrote that much in Spanish, so that when you compare my writing in English or Portuguese to that of Spanish, my Spanish writing is severely lacking. For someone like me whose main skill is communication, that is extremely frustrating. It feels like I'm always swimming with my clothes on. And just like with language, I'm not very adapted culturally to any particular place. I'm not really adapted to Mexico, I'm not adapted to Brazil, and although people seem to assume otherwise simply from my English, I am very much not adapted to American culture. You guys make no sense to me, like at all. I guess the reason I wanted to talk about this though was because I think this happens to a lot of people, not necessarily because they're third culture kids, but because there's something else that either excludes them or makes it difficult for them to interact with others. Then maybe someone who faces a similar, although very different problem and is just going through the internet could come across the series of videos we're making, watch this particular one, and it might make them feel slightly better. Ciao B, I'll see you on Monday.